All right. So that's all that symbolism stuff. But while we're talking about medieval Europe and witches, I do want to note that witchcraft was a rather harmless practice prior to the 14th and 15th centuries, which is medieval Europe for folks that might not know. And only after German Inquisitor Heinrich Kramer published the Malleus Maleficarum in 1487 were witches demonized and feared. And I didn't really know a lot of this history. This part was pretty interesting. So Kramer's book drew distinction between miracles, which were performed by saints in accordance with God or by God himself,
right?
Whereas magic was a private contract with the devil.
Correct.
Right? Yeah. Kramer outlined 3 distinct levels of offenses, with the slightest being a small secret group meeting, and the worst being basically respecting heresy, admiring heresy. And this was a text that was published like several times. It swept across Europe. And this created the image of the medieval witch, an evil woman, the same image that we think of today when we think of witches. This is the dude responsible for that. And this is the text responsible for that. So he spread this image across Europe via the Malleus Maleficarum, and it was used to demonize women and only spurred more texts that further developed this persona into a malicious sorceress, that cast charms and spells, and that was equated to devil-worshipping crimes. And, that led to a bunch of stuff, obviously, that we're all familiar with. And this was really just a useful ideological tool for the church to preach intolerance towards scapegoats, to explain social unrest, disease, natural disasters. So then I kind of pose that back to you, Antoine. How do you think they thought about this stuff? Like, it's all fun and games until you start burning people alive. The superstitions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I know the facts of it. I mean, I don't know. Do you want me? Look, the way it plays out based on what you're saying and based on what I do know about that period in that history is that a lot of paganism, a lot of it was matriarchal. I think is that the word I want? It's basically like women are kind of either not the head priest, that's not necessarily, but women held.
Didn't they control the money or something like
healers?
that?
I mean, I don't know about that. I don't know.
Maybe I'm getting cultures mixed up.
But with regard to like women were like the healers a lot of the time, and they basically held quite a bit. Like I don't want to oversell it, because I'm sure paganism had its machismo aspects to it as well, but to me, that feels like a power grab. It says it's like in paganism, women have a certain level of power, and if you want to strip them of all that power, well, the best way to do is to demonize them as part with that religion. Even though there were still many pagan men at that time, but if you're going to go after women in particular, and then you're going to flip the script in order to take power,
all you're doing is adding motive. All you're doing is adding motive behind it. You're adding, so you don't know the motive of labeling a black cat an agent of the devil, but you know the motive of labeling upstart women as witches.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's still, but my point is that they actually believed it. Like, they were at a state where they were like, yeah, that sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, that's definitely plausible.
If you're illiterate,
get her,
and you have very limited education, and the only education you're getting is from the church most often,
these people
why wouldn't you believe that?
Because there were no spells. It is like the Monty Python thing where he's like, she turned me into a newt. And then he looks at him and he's like, I got better. Like, it's like, what are you talking about? I mean,
First of all, this is like
if there was any civil unrest or disease or anything, that all got blamed on them. So I guess that is a real output of a secret gathering where they're doing whatever they do, charms or whatever it is. So I guess that's something real that you could label it as. But
the same thing happened in Salem, and that's like 300 years later.
I agree. It's crazy.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating to see how people will just buy into stuff without very little evidence.
There's an element of entertainment, unfortunately, with regard to it, especially at that time. Public executions, I mean, things of that nature weren't necessarily done to deter crime, because there was when people looked at the evidence, or when historians look at the evidence, there's no evidence that it was doing so. And I'm not sure that people at the time even really believed that. It's more about, well, this is a spectacle. There's not, there's no TV, there's no movies. The most interesting thing you could do is see someone get beheaded. So I'm just saying that there is an element of sport to it.
Yeah, I guess it's fascinating to me not to cast judgment on people in the past to say, you idiots.
Of course we can judge them.
What were you thinking?
Of course we can.
Well, I get it, but it is like it doesn't serve any real purpose other than like whatever. But it's like, wow, we have this symbolism.
The people of the past.
We have this symbolism today. It like survived. It survived off of our own ignorance and is now a staple in our culture.
It's amazing.
We have these depictions of warded women in pointy hats that fly on broomsticks. I guess we get to the ravens. And it's just like, oh yeah, that's where that came from.
Well, we just love story, Yeah. Read Joseph Campbell's what is it? Man with 1,000 Faces. But I think human beings are oriented around story, and stories carry with us more than anything else, more than science, more than necessary religion. The reason religion is so impactful is because it's a series of stories, and people it's just the way that we make sense of our world and make sense of ourselves. Not to get too philosophical about it, but when you frame it in that way, of course they're going to stay with us, even if they're being completely debunked. And it makes absolutely no sense to imagine a woman flying a raven, casting spells on the German folk of the 14th century. It's still it's a big enough spectacle that it would stay within the human like zeitgeist imagination. We would carry it forward to this day. I mean, when people think about the Odyssey,
but it's like it's known that like black cats get adopted less because of the superstition, right? Like,
that's what I'm saying. That's how ingrained it is. It stays with us. We just love a good story.
But your comment, because that just popped into my head, but like your comment before was like, they're harmless. They're no big deal. They're horoscopes that no one takes seriously, but it's not. It actually does influence decisions.
It does influence
and bias, even if it's unconscious bias.
You're absolutely right about that. Yeah.
So it's just, I don't know. I thought it'd be interesting to like dive a little deeper into like why these symbolisms exist, where they came from. Although we didn't get into all the history of it, it would be here forever. But folks, there are plenty of documentaries that go into a lot of detail. But I thought it was kind of interesting.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying it's sort of like our it's not Achilles heel. That's the funny thing. It's like without this like prolific affliction towards misbelief in like things that are just outside the realm of science and things that cannot be explained. But the thing is, without that, we wouldn't basically endeavor to the heights that we in good times choose to do so. It's like a
double-edged sword.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm trying to get at. Exactly. It's a necessary evil.
You're making the argument for war.
No.
War gives us all of our technological advancement today.
Yeah.
It's the same war. It's
that's
the same
because
war argument.
Yeah, well, there are other...
The atrocities justify our imagination.
It justifies the means.
We'd never dream of the moon if we didn't slaughter all those people.
That's unfortunate. Yeah.
But I get it. Like our imagination goes both ways. Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly.
It's like we have to have it. It's you have to have that element of just irrationality.
Like that non-linear thinking of based on everything we know today, this doesn't make sense. But
without it, we wouldn't make story.
It scares or inspires me into action.
Yeah, you have to be able to tap into it in order to tell stories, and without it, that's the thing. Even saying like, you look at a lot of storytellers. I mean, you look at Tolkien. I mean, these guys are professors. It's Professor Tolkien. I mean, these are very highly educated people that are telling grandiose, fairy tales of sorts. I mean, Tolkien might be a little bad example because people aren't too sure if he started to believe that his world actually existed near the end of his life. But let's just say that he did. C.S. Lewis, definitely his was made up, right? And without that element, you can't tell that kind of story. You have to be able to tap into to people who actually might believe in order to create a convincing story, something that will carry on for generations and people want to read and want to reenact and make other media off of it. At some level, you have to be able to tap into that. I believe it. And I have to write it as if I do believe it, because if you didn't write it, if J.R. Tolkien wrote The Hobbit thinking this was ridiculous, right? You wouldn't read it because it wouldn't, unless it's some
No,
sort
you
of
have
Gulliver's
to
Travels.
you have to allow yourself to be entertained and enthralled with the fantasy. You have to be
Yeah, but the
able to
characters, you have to
fantasize.
fall in love with the characters because the
Yeah,
characters are written in a believable way. That's what I'm saying.
yeah,
So you
you
have
have
to be
to.
able to tap into that same black cat, that same, I'm saying there's like a
Yes, you
there's a
have to be
through
able
thread with that.
to love and understand Gandalf. But then when you put your pen down and you go out for lunch, you don't try and cast spells on everyone and
That's only
tell
if you don't
people
have a
they
sense
shall
of
not
humor.
pass.
It's only if
Yeah.
you don't have a sense of humor.
Yeah, but you know what I mean? Like
I
you
wish
have
there were
to-
more stories of Tolkien standing at the entrance of a pub yelling, "Thou shalt not pass." Oh, shall not pass. I mean, that would be a really hilarious, like, Tolkien story. I
Yeah,
wish
it
he
would
did
be.
that.
He could have been the guy that collects tickets.
He could have.
All these things. All right. Anyway.